Well, welcome to the launch of Andrea Jeftanovich's novel Theatre of War, translated by Frances Riddle and published by Charco Press. We are delighted to have both the author and the translator with us today from Chile and Argentina respectively. And myself, I speak from far away, from Hong Kong. Before introducing both of them to the audience, I would like to mention the way that we have decided to shape this launch. The novel Theatre of War is divided as a play in 3 acts. So we will have 3 acts and interludes, which are the readings from both Andrea and Frances, to transition into the next section and the next questions. So currently this part of the event is, so to speak, equivalent to the stage directions. So now let's get into knowing our speakers. Andrea Jeftanovic was born in Santiago in 1970, and she's considered one of the most prominent contemporary Chilean novelists. Today, we're launching the translation of her 2000 novel, Escenario de Guerra, which is her first book translated into English. She has also published more fiction, for example, Geografía de la Lengua or Love in a Foreign Language in 2007, and 2 volumes of short stories, No aceptes caramelos de extraños, Don't Take Candy from Strangers from 2013, and Destinos Errantes or Wandering Destinations from 2016. Of Jewish and Serbian ancestry, Jeftanovic grew up among 3 religions, Russian Orthodox, Catholic, and Jewish. She studied sociology at the Catholic University in Santiago de Chile, and in 2005, she finished a PhD in Latin American literature at the very prestigious University of California, Berkeley. She has received several awards, including the Chilean Art Critics Circle Award and the National Book and Reading Council Award. Also, we have with us Frances Riddle, who lives in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she works as a translator, writer, and editor. She holds a Master of Arts in Translation Studies from the University of Buenos Aires and a bachelor's degree in Spanish literature. Her book-length publications include A Simple Story by Leila Guerrero, New Directions in 2017, Bodies of Summer by Martín Felipe Castañet, also from 2017 with Dalkey Archive Press, and The Life and Deaths of Ethel Jurado with Hispa Books, again in 2017. Her translations, interviews, articles, and reviews have appeared in magazines such as The White Review, Electric Literature, and The Argentina Independent, among others. Finally, and very briefly, I am Bárbara Fernández Melleda. I'm Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Hong Kong. My research focuses on contemporary Chilean literature, poetry and narratives, and their relationship to neoliberalism in Chile. I completed my PhD in Hispanic Studies at the University of Edinburgh in 2019. And now I'm going to give you a brief comment on the novel before we start with the questions and the readings. In my view, Theatre of War is not your average novel. It is not your typical novel of growth, nor is it an X-ray of a particular society. Theatre of War, to me, is a novel about a woman, about her perceptions from early childhood to adolescence and adulthood. Theatre of War is a portrayal of life itself, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. Love, fraternity, trauma, family struggles, separation, alienation, and reconciliation. The novel is both universal and deeply specific. It is a narrative text with wonderful poetic and dramatic textures that the translator artfully brought into the English language. From concrete portrayals of scenes from everyday life, the novel brings oniric images where it's hard to distinguish what's going on and why. And then we're taken back to the play itself, where all the characters have a part, and we, the readers, both witness it as it from the audience, but also as following the story by turning each page of the book. Jeftanovic set up an intricate structure for us to find ways to understand her main character, Tamara, and how her life is reminiscent of every girl's life, or maybe no others at the same time. Both unique and universal, Jeftanovic's debut novel, after 20 years, deserves even more praise as it is a timeless literary venture that is here to stay. So let us begin the first act of this launch with Andrea and Frances bringing us a fragment from the beginning of the novel. Over to you.
Me siento en la última fila. Desde aquí, El resto de los asientos vacíos se extienden como hileras de tumbas. Se abren las cortinas. Estoy en el sombrío comedor de mi casa. Hay algunos elementos, unas estatuas de piedra y el cuero de un lobo aplastado. En una esquina hay una mesa con 5 sillas. La de cabecera cojea. Unos rosetones desteñidos estampan el papel mural. Comienza la función de mi infancia. Sucesivos cambios de casa. No podemos anclarnos en ningún punto fijo. El camión de mudanza estacionado a un costado de la acera, los colchones resbalándose del techo y siempre mi triciclo en lo más alto de la pirámide. Tengo la misma edad de papá. Él se detuvo a los 9 años cuando comenzó la guerra. Yo tampoco quiero crecer más. Deseo acompañarlo en su tristeza de 9 años. Papá duerme con la luz prendida al igual que yo. Dice que en la oscuridad pueden entrar los árboles negros. Papá teme a la sirena de mediodía. A esa hora, un oficial del bigote lo saluda con su brazo alzado. Papá es un niño de 1,90 m, talla XL, manos arrugadas. Tengo los mismos años que papá, solo que él ha cumplido varias veces la misma edad. Papá está ausente mientras lee el diario y piensa en la guerra. Saca cuentas, suma, resta, extrae el promedio aritmético de esa época. Yo le digo que olvide, que en casa no hay más que soldados de plomo, pistolas de agua. Dice que alambres de púa rodean sus sueños. Papá se retrasa porque piensa en la guerra. Una marcha de botas galopa hacia sus oídos. Siempre lleva pan en sus bolsillos. Me prohibió leer libros de historia. Anota un año en sus piernas. No sabe que esconde una enciclopedia debajo de la cama que yo también registro esa fecha. Vigila la despensa. Contabiliza los alimentos no perecibles. Tarros en conserva, paquetes de arroz, bolsas de legumbres. Todos los días hace el inventario de la caja fuerte.
I sit in the last row. From here, the empty seats fan out like tombstones. The curtain rises on the shadowy dining room of my first home. Some familiar objects, the stone statues and the flattened wolf hide. In the corner sits the table with 5 chairs. The one at the head wobbles. The wallpaper is stamped with faded rosettes. The spectacle of my childhood begins. Repeatedly changing houses. We are unable to anchor ourselves to any fixed point. I'm the same age as Dad. He's stuck at age 9, which was how old he was when the war began. I don't want to get any older either. I want to stay with him and his 9-year-old sadness. Dad sleeps with the light on just like me. In the darkness, he says, the black trees might creep in. Dad is frightened by the siren at midday when a mustache officer greets him with an outstretched arm. Dad is a 6-foot-tall child, size XL, with wrinkled arms. I am the same age as Dad, just that he's turned the same age several times. Dad is absent as he reads the newspaper and thinks about the war. He does the math, adding, subtracting, calculating the length of that time period. I tell him to forget it, that there are only 10 soldiers and water guns here. He says that barbed wire surrounds his dreams. Dad is stuck in time, remembering the war. A march of boots gallops in his ears. He always carries bread in his pockets. He has forbidden me to read history books. He writes a year on his leg. He doesn't know that I hide an encyclopedia under my bed and that I know what that date means.
Thank you both for the wonderful reading of the opening of the novel. Well, obviously I have many questions for both of you, but for now, I'll just ask one question to each of you. So Andrea, let us start with a general question that many of us may be asking, which was kindly sent by a reader named Will. And he asks, was there one specific moment or event that inspired the writing of this book?
Thank you so much, Will, for this first question that allows me to go to the origins. I attended Chilean writer Tamara workshop, and there she asked us to write a piece of fictional biography with events that you had not experienced. In fact, the biographical element was secondary. What mattered was how the writing experience intervened these facts. So imagination was key. I thought it was a chance to experiment with memory, a complex genre. But I wonder what happens when your memories come from a catastrophic loss. When memory comes from experiences such as wars, persecutions, dictatorships, it's a process around black holes. There is a lack of reference in the change of memory, facts that were blocked or that were not properly translated, especially when you're dealing with memories that were inscribed in different languages. It is possible that second generations, as me, look for or invent missing links to make up for these silences and absences. In that sense, writing fiction is a response to that catastrophic loss that might help to complete that vacuum, to keep the explosion from sweeping everything away, leaving us without words, without memory. And also I think that remembering is closer to the exercise of evoking something from the past than rebuilding it. So why not to think of memory as a creative exercise and desire for transformation?
Okay, thank you, Andrea. It's wonderful to hear that you went to the Amela Titz workshop. From her own generation, she's one of the most prolific writers, and she's the national awardee. So that's great to hear. I had no idea myself, so it's good to learn.
No, I was very lucky, and I learned a lot with her. Yes,
definitely. Sounds like. And for you, Frances, what made you take on this translation project? Was there anything about theater of war that inspired you to become involved with it?
Well, I think this is the fourth book I've done with Charco. I'll say yes to anything Caro proposes because she has really great taste. But I was really excited when she approached me about the possibility of this project because I had actually translated Andrea once before, a short story of hers called The Need to Be a Son for the Short Story Project. So I was already a fan of her work, and she had been really warm when the story was published, taking the time to thank me for the translation. And I was also excited to work on this project because there are so few female Chilean writers that have been published in translation to English. So it feels good to help bring her voice to the English-speaking world.
Great, great, good to know. And yeah, I agree with you. There should be more Chilean writers being translated. I normally work with poetry, but I find out that either in poetry or in narratives, there's still more work to be done. So this is great. And of course, thanks to Charco for this. Well, now let's continue with another reading about Tamara's life. So we begin with Act 2.
Sangro cuando no debo, día por medio, todos los lunes. Lleno mis cajones con compresas de algodón y gasas que después presiono entre mis muslos. Papá se pone extraño cuando sangro. Esos días no me dirige la palabra. Nuestras miradas se encuentran en la mesa. Son tan parecidos nuestros ojos. Creo que cuando sangro, papá piensa que he herido a alguien. No recuerdo haber dañado a nadie. Tal vez lo hice, pero no lo recuerdo. Papá dice, no quiero sangre en esta casa. Es la única vez que golpea la mesa. Yo me escondo en el dormitorio y pongo mis calzones manchados contra la ampolleta que cuelga del techo. Observo el mundo a través de ese prisma. Las cortinas se ven salpicadas. La ventana es un hematoma. La puerta está cruzada por franjas veteadas. Este lugar se alumbra bajo una luz escarlata. Si cierro un ojo, el tono varía del púrpura al carmesí. Si abro el otro, del rojo intenso se pasa al rosa. Si giro rápido, el matiz ígneo enciende la alfombra. El género del cubrecama, la tela de las cortinas. Pero de pronto alguien toca la puerta y el fuego se extingue.
I bleed when I shouldn't. Every other day, every Monday, I fill my drawers with cotton pads and gauze that I press between my thighs. Dad acts strange when I bleed. On those days, he won't say a word to me. Our eyes meet at the table. They're so similar, our eyes. I think, when I bleed, that Dad thinks I've wounded someone. I don't remember having hurt anyone. Maybe I did, but I can't remember. Dad says I don't want any blood in this house. It's the only time he pounds the table. I hide in my bedroom and hang my stained underwear on the bare bulb suspended from the ceiling. I study the world through this lens. The curtains look splattered. The window is a hematoma. The door is marbled with red. The room is lit by a scarlet light. If I close one eye, the tone ranges from maroon to crimson. If I open the other, the intense red goes pink. If I turn quickly, the lava engulfs the rug, the bedspread, the curtains. But suddenly someone knocks on the door and the fire dies out.
Él me evade durante esos días, pero su silencio elocuente transmite su sentencia. No quiero sangre en esta casa. Mi cuerpo no responde, cumple el dictamen de su erosión. Es por esto que no quería crecer más. Solo necesitaba mis 9 años. Me siento mal, temiendo la hemorragia al acecho. Y llega la fecha. Ese manantial brota de mi cuerpo sin razón, endosándome una angustia de otro tiempo. Y su puño se estrella y rebota contra la cubierta de la mesa del comedor. No quiero sangre en esta casa, dice.
He avoids me during those days, but his eloquent silence transmits his message. I don't want any blood in this house. My body doesn't listen. It continues to erode. This is why I didn't want to grow up, why I wanted to stop at age 9. I feel bad, afraid of the lurking hemorrhage. Then the date comes, and the spring bubbles up from my body for no reason, weighing me down with the anguish of another time, and his fist bounces off the dining room tablecloth. I don't want any blood in this house, he said.
Thank you. Thank you. Here we see more aspects of Tamara's life, or Tamara's growth from a child to a teenager, and how she relates to the father figure, which is something that clearly crosses throughout the novel. I want to go back to the beginning of the book, Andrea, and ask you, because the book opens with striking quotations from Virginia Woolf and Elias Canetti. Can you explain what this means to you in the context of this book?
Yes, of course. In Virginia Woolf's case, I wanted to pay homage for her revolutionary narrative technique, the stream of consciousness, and specifically in the waves, where she goes beyond and explore the choral voice. In that novel, there's a group of classmates that, through their interventions, weave a collective voice, allowing us to go deep inside their psychic lives. And then, in the case of Canetti, I was struck by a scene of his book, The Tongue Set Free, where a little boy witnesses a secret event, and he recalls in this way. He says, "My earliest memory is dipped in red. A smiling man steps forth, walking towards me, and he says to me, "Show me your tongue," and I stick out my tongue. He pulls a jackknife, open it, and says, "Now we will cut off his tongue." So learning to write and to read and to speak with fear of having your tongue cut off is a very revealing image, an image possible linked in an individual and collective and conscious way with the fact of having learned to speak and to read and everything else during dictatorship, a historical period in which you were forced to keep quiet or to whisper. Books were banned, removed from circulation. Somehow we were threatened in the same way as Canetti is a main character. So I thought to myself, write, and someday you will be able to read this aloud.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful stories. And also like thinking about your own experience as a child during the dictatorship, which may also have imprinted some sense of witnessing in a particular perspective, which maybe is easier to sort of bring to Tamara's character. But going back to the issue you said about context, about dictatorship, I have a question for Frances. So in the translation process, how did you negotiate between the novels as fiction and its covered references to Chilean contemporary history or to the conflict abroad, one that may relate to former Yugoslavia? Did you have to do any special digging in preparation?
I didn't do any research beforehand. I tend to like to dive straight into a translation. I don't even usually sit down and read the book first because I really like the adventure of it, the sense of discovery. Once I get inside the book, it's easier to see where I need to do research to translate most effectively. But I don't really want to start out with too much more knowledge than the average reader would come into the text with. For this book, there were things I looked up, of course, but ultimately it's the story. The story's about Tamara. The trauma of war has left scars on her family, on her, but it wasn't the historical events that seemed to matter as much as the traces they left behind that were still reverberating through generations of this family.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting because, I don't know, maybe in the case of translating other types of books, perhaps history books and so on, that require like a secondary research, and you allow yourself to be surprised and to kind of delve into the book in your own experience as a reader. That's great. Well, a particularly striking aspect of the novel, from what you've been reading and from reading the whole text, is that it can be labeled as a Bildungsroman, that is a novel of growth, where the main character evolves from childhood to adulthood. And we have witnessed this both in the readings and when we read the novel ourselves. So from another reader, Christy, there is a question for Andrea. So she asks, were there any challenges when writing a narrative voice that begins in childhood but transforms into an adult voice in the end? Are childhood traits or naivety easier to convey through the writing itself or through the events in the story, do you think?
Well, thank you, Christy. This is a very interesting matter. In fact, it might be the reason why I wanted to explore a narrative from childhood. I have been interested in childhood as an aesthetic horizon, like a steep gaze, like standing in your tiptoes, or one that looks at the world from the knees of the adults. I guess you can all relate to that when you think of Charles Dickens, for example. I'm interested in this opposition between the child and the adult's gaze, almost as opposed categories. And also, childhood is a very ambivalent space, and fiction from childhood, always a strategic device, becomes a machine that pushes the notion of subjectivity. It pushes also language and imaginary into unforeseen areas. Child's point of view can be a critical perspective, always also a mechanism for denouncing violence and power abuse. Also, I think that memory is not remembering has not always pristine memories, probably more blurred and inter-memories. So when we remember, we do so using imagination and our world's point of view. In addition, if that point of view comes from a child, comes from a teenager, someone whose body and mind is in a permanent evolution, is very fascinated. Indeed, memory for me is not a static process. It is dynamic and porous, and is chaotic and poetic. So to begin with the main character as a young girl and end with her as an adult woman was an opportunity to experiment very important events in life, like love, sexuality, illness, death, and also your own life.
Great, thank you. And from that process, Frances, how is it for you to make the text progress as Tamara ages in the narrative? I ask because there are the perspective itself shifts with age, and also that changes her voice, and so the use of language changes in the text. How was that for you?
I have to say I was just following Andrea's lead. So whatever her intention was, I have to hope it came through in the translation.
Okay, all right. So for you, it was just a matter of following the author's lead, and did the voice come naturally to you to translate into English?
I think it did. I think it's a very strong voice, and so it's easy for it to just kind of take over, you know?
Yeah. I felt the same when reading the text, and I've only read the English version, and for me it was quite a fluid voice in the translation, so I could just follow and realize the connection between the girl, the adolescent, and the woman in the at the passage of time. So excellent. And now I have a question for both of you. More than a question, it's kind of a reflection, and then you can tell me what you think. So I would like to ask you about the act of writing, be it an original text in the case of Andrea, or the translation of one that inevitably changes and perhaps has its own life after being rewritten in a different language, so to speak, because the act of translation is also an act of writing itself. So I would like to read a quotation from the book in order to frame this bit, which is from page 58. And it says, from Tamara's perspective, "In the mornings, I copy the script of my dreams into a notebook with thick pages. Blurry characters speak and disappear, crossing paths without even meeting in real life. They whisper messages in my ear. They chase me. They leave me." So I'm asking you both. I don't know, Andrea?
Okay.
About the act of writing?
Yes. Well, first, I think something happens between the hand and the brain.
Okay.
More specifically, with handwriting. For me, has been very important. Handwriting in notebooks. I have my house full of notebooks. There is a mystery in that exercise. It's different to think an idea to write it down. First, that. And also, I believe that writing has been my homeland, the space where I belong, because the more you understand the nature of writing, the more you understand that as individuals, we must not passively accept your destiny or your heritage. maybe what set us apart from other living beings is the chance of naming your heritage, and also to the chance to reformulate your destiny. Art is a way to challenge your circumstances, allowing you to open to new configurations of the world. I like to think that writing has to do with what is behind the scene. Mm-hmm. And also there's like a mystery. Sometimes it's like an error, but that error, in that error, you can have findings and revelations. So yeah, I trust a lot in writing. For me, it has very, very important exercise. And as I just told you, especially handwriting, for me, still is very important. It's my first stage before I write a novel or a short story collection.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Frances?
Well, so yeah, I guess it's really interesting what you're saying, Andrea, because I guess even writing is a translation process, translation from ideas to words, right? And so there are many options possible in that process. For me, translating is much easier than writing because the idea is already there. You just have to get it in different words. And my process involves first just kind of like vomiting the text into the other language without thinking too much about how it sounds. And then I go back and I try to very carefully, line by line, check it against the original to make sure that I haven't missed any meaning or distorted the intention at all. And then after that, I kind of try not to look back at the original unless there's something I'm still struggling with, because I feel like at some point I need to focus on the English, since that's all the reader of the translation will see. And then the copy editor comes in this case it was Robin Myers, who did a great job editing it, and she points out places where the wording still sounds odd because you're contaminated by the original and you know, it's impossible not to be. And so that kind of moves things even further from the original. Doing this bilingual reading actually and seeing the text side by side, again, I see things and I wonder, how did that get changed and why? And I have the urge to kind of go back and edit again. I mean, there's just so many possible versions of a text in a translation. So
yeah, what you say is right. There are so many possible versions. But then again, I still think that somehow the text has its own life in the translated version, which obviously comes from Andrea's work because she wrote the text and it's her ideas and her vision. But I think the translated text also, one way or another, has a life of its own. So let's move forward to the next reading from Act 2. So please.
Franz apareció en mi vida para quedarse en forma vaga. Me rozaba mientras se perdía entre su soledad. Paso la noche con él. En la mañana siguiente, salgo de la habitación con los zapatos en una mano y con la otra tanteando la pared helada. En el umbral de la puerta no resisto y miro hacia atrás. Él me está mirando, sonríe, me llama despacio. El calzado rebota en el piso de madera. Regreso a sumergirme en su tibieza. Me quedo así, al interior de su paréntesis. No te vayas. Tengo un agujero en el pecho. Me mira con ojos vidriosos. Un agujero en el pecho, un pozo profundo, una laguna seca. He perdido la noción del contorno de mi cuerpo que se funde con el suyo, formando nuevos volúmenes. Somos una montaña, una mesa, un árbol, un caballo salvaje, una estrella. Respiramos profundo, abrazados muy fuerte, como si algo nos fuera a separar. En medio de la noche siento que Franz me susurra palabras inconexas, sonidos circulares en el oído. Me había olvidado completamente de su pulgar, seguro, en la raíz de mis caderas, frotándome despacio el pubis. Me había olvidado completamente de la rodilla apoyada en mi rodilla, de los pies comprimidos uno junto al otro, de las cabezas lacias, demasiado próximas. En el ángulo recto que se forma entre sus hombros, arrimo mi cabeza. Permanecemos un instante bajo el agua y luego volvemos a salir juntos en el sueño. Te habría escuchado siempre. No podías imaginar la turbación de entrar en la corriente de tus pensamientos. Empezamos todo otra vez, con los ojos aún cerrados. Su boca succiona, muerde, deja cicatrices.
Franz appears in my life and sticks around in a hazy sort of way. He brushes past me, lost in his loneliness. I spend the night with him. In the morning, I leave the bedroom with my shoes in one hand and the other feeling its way along the cold wall. Reaching the doorway, I can't resist looking back. He's staring up at me, smiling. He calls out to me quietly. My shoes click against the wooden floor. I submerge myself in his warmth. I lie there, inside his parentheses. Don't go. I have a hole in my chest. He looks at me with glassy eyes. A hole in his chest, a deep well, a dry lagoon. I've lost all notion of my body's own limit as it melds with his, forming new shapes. We're a mountain, a plateau, a tree, a wild stallion, a star. We breathe deeply, gripping each other tightly, as if something were trying to separate us. During the night, Franz whispers incoherent words, circular sounds in my ears. I'd completely forgotten about his protective thumb on my hip, slowly rubbing my crotch. I'd completely forgotten about his knee resting on my knee, feet pressed together, tired heads touching. I rest my head on the straight line of his shoulders. We stay underwater for a moment and then fall back to sleep together. I would have listened to you forever. You can't imagine the bewilderment, slipping into the flow of his thoughts. We start all over again, with his eyes still closed, his mouth sucking, biting, scarring me.
Thank you both. That is a wonderful passage, and it reads really well in English and Spanish. It's great. Considering the translation, Frances, I'd like to ask you something in particular. Some passages of the English version read very poetic, so I imagine they were both challenging and rewarding to translate. What would you say was the most challenging bit to translate in the text, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, that's exactly the hardest part, were the very poetic phrases. And I love a translation challenge. I think it's fun to find a solution. There were phrasings that were had very bold, beautiful imagery, but then I put them into English and it didn't really make sense, or I worried that it might sound like Google Translate, you know, it just nonsense almost. So Robin Myers, who worked as copy editor on this project and who is herself a poet, I think really helped me find solutions, very beautiful, elegant solutions to some of the more poetic parts that I was having doubts about.
Okay, yeah, because as I said before, I really haven't read the original one, but I was really moved by some of the chapters and how poetic they were, and that was transmitted to the translation. It shows very skillful work, and I could tell that the process perhaps was more complex than translating any other sort of bit of the novel that was, let's say, more straightforward, right? So that was really good work. So congratulations on that, Frances. Andrea, over to you. Can you expand on the juxtaposition of the theatrical, the oniric, and the real in the novel? Is Tamara trying to tell us life is a big act?
Probably yes. Yes, because I wanted to explore the devastating psychological effects that war and dictatorships making people. I was working always with the nameless war or dictatorship, more or less. So I was interested in how the eyes of Tamara, a 9-year-old girl, see this, how this family redesigned their existence, the life strategies that arises from damaged memory, And I wanted to rehearse the child's point of view, free of ideological apprehensions. So probably it could be in a playful way, and I found theater as a playful way, resorting to the theatrical play where they transform her life and their life, the whole family, into a miss and a son. Also, I was seduced to speak about war and about dictatorship, not as a verbal discourse, but through body. What happens to the limbs with issues like food, how we somatize trauma, and the theater was an excellent resource to stage all this pain. And related to the oniric language, I think oniric dreams they have so plasticity and the richness of all the symbols they are when you dream, all the symbols that appear. And so it was, I think it's very expressive, the dreams. And I think reality is not enough to explain our complexity, our lives. And I do believe that dreams are texts, are messages, are narratives that we should count on.
Yeah, well, I wanted to get back to the idea of the importance of the theater in the text. And for me, the most interesting thing as a critic is that it's a narrative theater, because it's not a play to enact, it's a play that is being narrated. So we are witnessing it, we're seeing it from the outside, imaginatively, at the same time that we are reading the text as a text. So I find that intricacy very, very interesting. And of course, the plasticity of dreams gives you a completely new dimension to develop these ideas that are difficult to, let's say, to digest clearly. Yeah, thank you for that explanation, and it's much clearer now. And finally, I have two questions, so in which I'm going to ask you to comment on each other's work. So I would like to direct you in this way. So I'm the stage director now. So I use my faculties. So I'll just leave the questions there, and then you go for it, okay? And then we finish with reading the last bits. So can you, Frances, tell Andrea what you enjoyed the most about her work? And you, Andrea, can you tell us what was your reaction when seeing the novel translated into English for the first time? Because I think that Frances did an amazing work. So
yes.
Can we start with you, Frances?
Yeah, I think what I loved most about this book was the unconventional narration style. I've translated about a dozen books now, and they've had like really weird stuff in them, all of them. But this was, I think, the most unique and just the most original structure. I love the super short chapters that really pull you through the book very quickly, the leaps in time, the poetic writing. And I really love the feeling that this protagonist has kind of shared her deepest, darkest secrets with you. And there's a sense of intimacy, like you really know and understand her. And it was just a beautiful project to work on.
Thanks. So, sorry about that. It's just that the office automatically turns off the lights due to lack of movement, not due to lack of speaking. Anyway, Andrea, your reaction when you saw the translation?
Oh, well, amazing. I'm very impressed and grateful for Frances' work in translating the novel. Reading Frances' translation, I was struck by the use of poetry and the rhythm she chose. Also, English language tends to be more concise and more accurate, at least than Spanish. So it was very revelatory for me as the author to reread my own piece with that emotional distance. And that also related with the idea of theater, maybe taking this concept of Bertolt Brecht about the epic theater. So maybe English language is in a way related to what Brecht called the distance, the critical distance. So reading the translation made me think on how it will be to write it again in Spanish with a different tone, with this more emotional distance. So both. I'm really happy because of the poetry and the wonderful work of Frances, and also I'm very impressed of what happened with the novel in English.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, could you rewrite your own novel if you were to translate your own translated novel into Spanish again? That sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But that would be another text, wouldn't it? Would be another rewriting of the writing that took place in the translation. Well,
Why not?
let's move on. Yeah, why not? Sounds like a very intricate project, just like the novel is intricate. Anyway, so let's go to the reading of Act 3, please.
Se abren las pesadas cortinas del teatro. Es el día de la representación. Se ilumina el vasto escenario. El reparto nos depara sorpresas. Nos representaremos por primera vez en presencia del otro. Hemos memorizado un texto y el gesto que nos caracteriza. Nuestros laberintos han confluido en la misma salida.
The heavy curtains part. It's opening night. The vast stage is illuminated. The cast delivers surprises. We perform for the first time in the presence of others. We've memorized our lines and the expressions that distinguish us. Our labyrinths have led us out.
De un costado del escenario salen algunos personajes. Caminan hacia el comienzo de las tablas. Entre los espesos velos de terciopelo se asoma mamá. Arrastra los pies, lleva las muñecas vendadas y se para en el centro. Está muy maquillada. Tiene delineado el vértice de los ojos. Retoca su boca con un lápiz labial. Mamá se ha teñido el pelo rubio. Le queda bien. No grita, no grita, no grita. Me dice que hace tiempo que no se enferma. Me mira de otra forma. Me mira. Susurra una melodía con su garganta. Su rostro cambia de expresión. Se ve tan cansada.
The characters stand in the wings, walk to the edge of the stage. My mother appears from between the heavy velvet veils. She shuffles her feet. Her wrists are bandaged and she stops at center stage. She wears heavy makeup. Her eyes are lined. She retouches her lipstick. Mom has dyed her hair blonde. It suits her. She doesn't scream, she doesn't scream, she doesn't scream. She tells me she hasn't been sick in a long time. She looks at me differently. She looks at me. She hums a melody in her throat. Her expression changes. She looks tired.
Papá se sube a mis hombros. Camino con él encima. Su cuerpo pesa. Me cruje la clavícula y papá sigue en mis hombros. Se tensiona la espalda, el cuello. Giro y papá gira conmigo sobre mis hombros. Avanzo por el escenario. Doy vueltas para un lado y otro. Giro en cámara lenta. Papá, montado sobre mí, no quiere salir de mis hombros. Avanzo hasta el centro del escenario con papá en mis hombros.
Dad climbs onto my shoulders. I carry him. He's heavy. My collarbone compresses under his weight. My back and neck tense. I turn and Dad turns with me. I walk across the stage. I move from one side to the other. I turn in slow motion. Writing atop me, Dad doesn't want to get down. I walk to the center of the stage with him still on my shoulder.
Soy Tamara, yo soy. Quiero ser invisible. Quiero existir debajo de una mesa. Quiero ordenar el armario. Mi tiempo es vertical. En la memoria las cosas ocurren por segunda, por tercera vez. Temo amanecer diluida en una mancha. Mi tristeza se ladea cuando me acuesto en la cama. ¿Quién me quiere cepillar el pelo? ¿Quién quiere cuidar mi reloj y mi perro de loza? Soy.
I'm Tamara. I'm me. I want to be invisible. I want to live under a table. I want to clean out my closet. Time is vertical for me. In my memory, events occur a second time, a third. I'm afraid of melting into its stain as I sleep. My loneliness moves aside when I lay down in bed. Who wants to brush my hair? Who wants to look after my watch and my porcelain dog? I am. Soy papá. Leo en un idioma ajeno. Me protejo en un alfabeto sin memoria. Siempre tengo sed. En mis sienes palpita un tranvía. Quedé en la dirección opuesta. Piso la sangre de mi padre y me elevo. Fui.
I'm Dad. I read in a foreign language. I take shelter in an alphabet without history. I'm always thirsty. A tram rumbles through my head. I'm stuck, facing the wrong direction. I step in my father's blood and stand up. I'm gone.
Soy Franz. No soy de fiar. Registro tus cosas cuando no estás. Tengo un agujero en el pecho. Busco la esquina dorsal de una ciudad. El horizonte mecánico de la muerte. Mi deseo es un borde áspero. ¿Dónde dejé mis zapatos? Voy descalzo. Fui.
I'm Franz. I'm not to be trusted. I look through your things where you're not here. I have a hole in my heart. I search the back corners of the city. Test the mechanical limits of death. My desire has a rough edge. Where did I leave my shoes? I'm barefoot. I'm gone.
Nuestros monólogos cruzados se elevan hacia la bóveda de la sala. Los personajes se escriben unos a otros. Damos vida a una pose que nos identifica. El director de la obra detiene la escena. Es un instante muerto para nuestros personajes. Nos contempla y corrige nuestras posturas. Se diluye la interrupción y damos vida al gesto pendiente, ahora reformado. Se fragmenta el cuadro. Sabemos que la representación ya no es la misma.
Our overlapping monologues float up to the dome of the theater. We rewrite each other's parts. We bring our characters to life. The director stops the scene. Our characters pause. He examines us and corrects our postures. The performance loses momentum as we try out new poses and expressions. The scene deteriorates. We know the show is no longer the same.
The curtain falls, the audience applauds and cheers. Those of us on stage don't know what to do. We fidget awkwardly. From up here, we see only anonymous heads, black dots. Then we look at each other. We bow and take each other's hands, all of us gripping, for an instant, the same lifeline.
Cae el telón. Los espectadores aplauden. Los que estamos en el escenario no sabemos qué hacer. Nos movemos inquietos. Desde aquí solo vemos cabezas anónimas, puntos negros. Entonces nos miramos unos a otros. Hacemos una reverencia y trenzamos las manos aferrándonos, por un instante, a la misma cuerda de vida.
thank you both for this wonderful bilingual reading. It was really good to hear you both, Andrea in English and Frances in Spanish. It was really lovely. The last bit was very interesting when you both talk about this anonymous audience watching this theater of war. It made me think about also the other audience, which is us, the readers, because we're also anonymous. It's the eyes of the nameless readers also what you have witnessing this theater from wherever we are turning the pages. That was really special. It was really beautiful. So congratulations to you both. Well, from my part, to end up, I would just like to say that the novel brings many topics which are worthy of attention, and we could have talked about them for hours and hours, as this novel is very rich in topics. So some of these topics, maybe for future reference, we've talked about memory, the diasporic experience, sexuality, life and death, relationships with mom, relationship with dad. Life as a whole has been narrated in this book. And there's plenty more to consider and to learn from the reading of this wonderfully human novel. We must not forget this novel is very human. So on behalf of the organizers, to the audience, I say thanks for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed reading Andrea Jeftanovich's novel, Theater of War, skillfully translated by Frances Riddle and published by the one and only Charco Press. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Carolina Orloff.
Sí.
Yes. Thanks, Charco.
I'm very grateful because of her work, and I'm very proud to be part of her catalog.
Thank you.